hearing from each of these gentlemen. They each have impressive biographies, and we'll touch on that as we go through the questioning. But I wanted to start off briefly. Of course, Ken, John, Wesley are here to talk about their work, their art, and what it means not only to Mississippi, but to our relationship and how we live in our world. So I'd like to start off first with Ken. And if you could tell us a little bit about yourself, Ken, and then fold that into your work. For example, this is a man that has guts. Age 17, leaves high school, St. Stanislaus in Bay St. Louis, joins the Army. He becomes a tank commander in Korea. John, tell us a little bit about yourself and then how that informs your work.
Well, I was born in Germany as a military brat, and we moved all over. And my dad was from Gulfport, my mom was from Bay St. Louis, and I wound up in Bay St. Louis because that was my home. And I love being on the water. So I found out through the years that if I would found myself in a part of the country where there was no large bodies of water, I was miserable. So I had to get back to the coast. I love the smell of the coast, the salt, the fish, the air. I can deal with the hurricanes. Been wiped out several times, but that's life. So high school was tumultuous. I quit high school in 11th grade. 26 days after I turned 17, I joined the Army. And that was March of 1971. I found myself 6 months later in Korea. Well, about 8 months later, I found myself in Korea. And soon thereafter, I was a tank commander, and I was in tanks for 5 years. And on an eventful day, I got shipped to Germany. I got transferred to Germany, and Germany was a pretty tough military base because all you did was play war. So you stayed out in the field, and you know, it was a rough duty. But anyway, I was over there, and we were on an exercise, and I blew my finger off loading a simulator device that the Army had developed. It's a long story. I don't have time to get into it. But that led to me, because in the Army, if you don't have a trigger finger, you can't be in a combat MOS. So they said, well, you got to do something else. So they put me in a hobby shop where they had a photographer. This was a brand new photo lab, hobby shop for the military in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. And they gave me the job because I was the new guy. The guy that was doing the photo section got fired for stealing equipment, and they told me to go in and take over. I said, I don't know anything about photography. They said, well, it doesn't matter, just go in there and let everybody do whatever they want. I can do that part. So I got in there and started, letting people do what they do, and they would develop film and make pictures, and the facility was unbelievable. It had everything you could imagine as a studio: film, cameras, lights, action, and they encouraged me to just, learn whatever I could. So this little old lady came in today. I can't remember her name, and I'm sorry about that. But she came in and started teaching me how to do black and white. And once I started to do black and white, I fell in love with the process of making an image. And as they say, the rest is history. Within, I think, 6 months of getting that job, I placed third in an international military photo contest for a landscape photo of a corn shed that was on the place where I was living in Missouri. So I didn't even know at the time, I was just a dumb kid. They gave me $75 savings bond. I was like, man, you can win money with this stuff? And I said, I kind of like this. And so I started pursuing it, and then I found out I could go to college, So I wound up going to college at the Rochester Institute of Technology in New York on a VA voc rehab. thing, and I turned into a photographer, and I've been doing it ever since. I graduated from RIT in '86, and I moved back to New Orleans, started assisting for other photographers and doing the route that most photographers take as young photographers. You always work for somebody else and learn things. But then I was working for Neil White at Coast Magazine. I don't know if any of y'all remember Coast Magazine on the coast, but I was their photo editor. And of course, if you know that story, it went to hell in a handbasket. I mean, you know, things happen. But so I found myself without a job with about 100,000 images I didn't know what to do with. And I was like, well, I got to find something to do. So I started contemplating what is it I like to do. And I had a large body of work of the coast from Coast Magazine. So my brilliant mind, I'll just do a coffee table book. Which, I don't know if anybody, y'all ever do a coffee table? It's not the most, it's a very expensive process. So I had no idea what I was doing or how I was doing it, but I just started pursuing it and found people that knew what they were doing. I would go to the bookstore and find out who designed the book and call them up. You know, hey, how do you do this? Well, I'll do it for you for $10,000. Jeez. Okay. So that's how it happened. So I did my first book, My South Coast Home, and it was basically stock stuff that I had in my files. And my theory was the only thing I had that I could leave my kids some sort of legacy would have been the book. Trying to sell that many pictures, it's almost impossible to sell photographs these days. A lot of people don't think they're art, you know, whatever. But so the one book did well, so I said, let's do another one. So I decided to do Mississippi. So for 5 years, I traveled around the state in between jobs. So I would like do a commercial job. I would make a little money. I would say, see you in a week or two. Go take off on the road. And I actually used the book Off the Beaten Path by Marlo Kirkpatrick as my guide. And I told Mar, I even gave her credit in the book because I used her book to go around and find all the places in Mississippi. And it took 5 years, but it was well worth it. I think I've been to every county. Then we had to come up with something else. You start down the road and you got to just keep going. And so then we decided, John Evans from Lemuria suggested I do a blues book with Scott Beretta, who was the first editor of Living Blues magazine. And Scott, I'm not a blues man, I'm a blues novice, but John thought it would be a good book. So, and Scott thought it'd be a good book. So Scott acted as our guide, and we just traveled the state for years, meeting blues people, photographing them, going to juke joints, drinking at juke joints. And we did that. I got to say, that's probably my funnest book so far. Just because you got to listen to music and drink. Who can make a job out of that? Right? Life is good.
May I interject? I want to come back to that.
Yeah.
But if we could ask John to give a little bit of a background as well, talk about how he came to the bicycle logs with Walter Anderson, but also a little bit about your background, and particularly what I've always found fascinating is that, like your father, you spent a good bit of time on Horn Island, if I recall, as a park ranger?
Yes, yes. Well, we've got one of our Horn Island campers here today. We've been going on camping trips, at least 2 a year, 4-day camping trips. And the last one that Scott went on was probably one of the best. It is a transformative experience. It is something that transforms your reality. And that kind of segues into the purpose of the book, the meaning of the book. Last week, an exhibit of Daddy's art opened at the Max Museum in Meridian. And it's titled The South's Most Elusive Artist. And people have been searching for Walter Anderson for more than 60 years. Ever since his death, people have been trying to get to know who he was. And this book that actually Anthony Thaxton and I put together is about that search. It's the process of searching for Walter Anderson and what happens when you search for him. There's a lot of confusion about who Daddy was. And about 5 years ago, I got together with Anthony Thaxton, and we talked about, each of us talked about our own personal quest, our own personal search for Walter Anderson. And the net result, or the end result of that, was that Anthony produced an incredible award-winning film called The Extraordinary Life and Art of Walter Anderson, and a book that went with that film. And this book, The Bicycle Logs of Walter Anderson, is a part of the continuing process of helping people to search for Walter Anderson. The story that goes with him has always been filled with a good number of contradictions and inconsistencies. We know who he was from his art. His art tells the story. And in this book, Anthony Thaxton curates an exhibit of Daddy's art that in itself tells that story of who he was. Other people have tried to tell a story of who he was, but unfortunately, most of those stories are inconsistent with the story that the art tells. So we decided to put out a book in which the story that the art told was the same as the story that the words told. And we did that by focusing upon his art and upon his own writings. Daddy kept journals. He went on a series of quests or adventures, and during each one of these quests, he kept journals. And many of you are the people that know my father are familiar with his Horn Island journals, which he wrote toward the end of his life. But he also wrote journals early on in his life. And these journals are primarily the ones that he wrote earlier. His first biographer, Redding Sugg, referred to him as Adam in a Hat because he felt that Daddy had rediscovered Eden in the time of hats. And that's actually the best description I've ever heard of him, because he did obviously feel like he was living in Eden, and his art reflects that. But the Horn Island logs, and the Horn Island logs tell you that, but they don't tell you how he got there. And these earlier journals are part of his search for his own personal Eden. And by publishing them, I'm hoping that we're kind of providing a roadmap, or you could call it a treasure map, because inevitably it led to an incredible amount of creativity, an incredible amount of productivity. And that's the story that his art tells. His art tells us about a man who was more creative than most people, and more productive than most people. I'm talking too long. I'm sorry, Scott.
No, not at all. It's very illuminating, interesting, and we'll come back because I know there's going to be some questions from the audience as well as some other discussion among us. But I wanted to introduce Wesley, and his book is Mississippi's Natural Heritage, Photographs of Flora and Fauna. There's a reason I'm not going through his biography. He's a research scientist. He works in areas of study where I cannot pronounce what he's working on. So this is my easy out to say, Wesley, please tell us about yourself and then how you found your way to photography and photographing so many beautiful images in Mississippi.
Thank you. I join with my colleagues here in loving the natural world. I think that's what unites all three of us. I've been a biologist all my life. I got a PhD at LSU, fighting tigers. It's game day. I got the PhD in tropical medicine and parasitology. After LSU, I went on to become a professor at Murray State University, where I was there for a couple of years. Go Racers. And then I was invited to go up to the Merck Institute up into Satan land up in the Northeast. I was invited by a man named William Campbell, who I worked with for 20 years. And the work that was done there, he went on to win a Nobel Prize in medicine for. That work discovered ivermectin and the ivermectins. If you've ever treated your dog with heartworm medication, you used our product. Thank you very much, ka-ching. That allowed, we paved the streets in gold up there with that compound. It was one of the first that ever made $1 billion a year. It was really phenomenal, and it led not only into revolutionizing chemotherapy for veterinary medicine, but it also moved into human medicine, and we're actually about to eradicate the second organism that humans intentionally wanted to eradicate, which is onchocerciasis in Africa. So I have had most of my life in veterinary and human medicine. After that, I went on to DuPont for a few years and discovered the isoxazolines, which probably mean nothing to you. But out of that came a product called NexGard, which you may use for your animals. It was the first flea and tick oral product. Again, ka-ching. I have the patent on it, still have the patent on it. It was a nice find. And it's interesting to go down with my cats and now get charged $80 a pill to dose each one of them. At any rate, my parents being elderly at the time, I returned to Mississippi to take care of them in their final years. And when they passed, I found that I was orphaned and stranded here. And I came to love Mississippi, came to live the wildlife here, and also recognize, even though we think Mississippi is one where we've got a lot of fishermen and a lot of hunters and we know a lot about our organisms, we don't really. We may know a lot about white-tailed deer, we may know a lot about largemouth bass and green-winged teal, But after that, our knowledge plummets very quickly. And people think that you have to take a trip to the Serengeti or to the Amazon to see interesting things. No, you don't. They're right here. You just have to open your eyes. I always make the comment that in my own yard, I have a simple yard. I've recognized over 750 species in my yard alone. You do not have to travel. You have to just open your eyes. And I wrote the book to try to reintroduce people to Mother Nature. We live in a stainless steel Tupperware world where we get in our cars and run to work, run inside because we can't stand the heat, run back out, go to Walmart, same thing, and you go home, shut the doors, and you never go outside. And I wrote the book to put in there 400 organisms across the board, from invertebrates through birds, snakes, reptiles, you name it, it's in there, God, man, and the universe, to reintroduce people to your backyards. And I purposely did not put anything in there exotic or crazy in Mississippi. I wanted to show you things that you can find, that you can go out and find very, very, very quickly. And so that in a nutshell is how I came to be. I'm a biologist first, and somewhere down the line I learned how to use a camera. I've never considered myself a photographer, but I guess in a backwards way I came to be one. But at any rate, that's how I came to be where I am today.
Thank you for correctly pronouncing all those words. I couldn't have done it. Ken, and I didn't quite mean to do this, but I cut you off a bit, but I think you were coming to the point where I would consider this almost the perfect arc, in that you've had several successful books. What you're offering to us now is an iteration of your first book that was so popular. Do you want to talk about My South Coast Home Revisited and how you got to this point?
Yeah. Again, we're trying to think of what else to do. So I decided to do a revisit of My South Coast Home because, the coast got wiped out in Katrina, so it had changed. My first book was The Coast Before Katrina. But what I like to tell people, it was before Katrina, but it was also after Camille. So I actually knew of places that were still damaged from Camille when I was doing the Katrina stuff. And my goal, what led me down this path sort of was traveling and listening to people's misperceptions of Mississippi. And I was like, man, they ain't got a clue. And so I said, I'm going to do a book that show people what Mississippi and how beautiful Mississippi is. And then that way I don't have to try and explain to them what Mississippi is, because nobody really understands Mississippi. You say you're from Mississippi, they're like, oh, God. You belong to the Klan? So, they have no clue, a lot of people, once you get out of the South. So my goal was to expose Mississippi for the beauty that I found in it. And that was my original goal, and that's been my goal ever since. And that's still my goal. My South Coast Home, what made Revisited, what makes it different, other than it's all new photographs, but I taught myself how to use a drone, which I call a flying camera. And it added perspectives from, we're lowlanders here. So we don't get to, if you go in other parts of the country, you can drive up on a hill and overlook the city and do things like that. You can't do that here. You're flat. So whatever you're looking at, that's what you're looking at. So the drone, the flying camera, gave me the ability to show views that most people don't get to see. And one of my things was I like showing people things they are familiar with, but they're looking at it in a different way. So, it kind of sticks with you. And they say, oh, yeah, I remember seeing that, or, whatever. So I just decided to do My South Coast Home Revisited. And we did it for about 3 years. Taught myself a drone, had to get a license. Can't make $1 with a drone if you don't have a license. I don't know if y'all know that. any of you young guys out there, get on the drone business. It's a future. I mean, drones are going to be having a major impact in our life. But that's off the subject. But I think this book is actually my best one so far. I kind of equate it to Mississippi because it, a little bit. But now what I want to do is Mississippi revisited with the drone. So we'll go back and I met with Archives and History and asked them about it. And oh God, I can't think of the guy's name now. Bob, one of the researchers over there. He sent me a whole list. He just basically went back through my Mississippi book. Here, do all these again, because they've been updating their information on a lot of stuff. So that's probably what I'm going to do next. I'm going to go back through Mississippi. The only problem with that is the amount of travel that's involved. And what I do a lot of times, I don't just go somewhere and take a picture. I'll go to a location. I'll try to get there at the perfect time. But if I get there and the light's wrong, or it's overcast, or it's just not what I want, I'll write it in a book, come back next May on such and such a date at 5 a.m. And that's what I'll do. And then I'll go to the next location, and I just keep going around the state like that. There are several locations that I had to go 3 times to get what I wanted. And, photography is all about light. So if the light's not right, you're not getting a good photograph. And what I like to tell people is, I'm not creating anything. All I'm doing is showing God's work. The only thing I regret is that blind people can't experience it. And I wish there was a way you could verbalize it for them, but I don't think there is. I just don't believe, without seeing the colors and the this and the that you can't explain it to anybody, So I like to say all I'm doing is documenting God's work and putting it in a book. And that doesn't make me some great person. It's just God is the great person, not me. So that's where I am right now. I mean, this story goes a long way back, but I don't know what else to say.
Well, that's fine.
That's very rare right there.
Drones will do that to you. Yeah. John, I wanted to ask you about something in the bicycle blog. There is an image that is unlike other images that we're used to seeing of your father. Could you explain
which images?
I think is it on page 14 or so? Your father appears to look different in that photograph or image of himself, a painting of him.
Is it the one in Naugle?
I think so, yes. Yeah.
Daddy was actually a very practical person. People don't understand that, but he was extremely practical. He went on these long bicycle trips that might be as long as 2,000 miles. And it wasn't unusual for him to travel 200 or 300 miles a day. And sometimes one of those trips was across Texas in August. And the tires on his bicycle melted. And, he got obviously he's going to get a little warm. And Daddy, being a very practical person, would just strip off his clothes and find a nice cool pool of water by the side of the road and lie down and enjoy himself thoroughly, which is actually a good example how human experience can be relative. If you're extremely hot, a cool pool of water can be heaven. And while he was in that pool of water, a bullfrog would stick its head up and blow bubbles at him, so he'd grab grab a pad and make a drawing, make a painting. A snake would slither by. He thoroughly enjoyed it, and he called those experiences nullas. I think we had in his family, I think one of our relatives was posted, was in the English Army and was posted to India, and I think that word comes from India. But he loved his nullas, and if you read the book, you'll learn that very quickly, because he tells us as much about the nullas as he does about the bicycle riding. I wanted to, do I have a few seconds, Scott?
Absolutely.
I wanted to address the issue of contradictions between what people think about Dad and who he was. And the best way I can think of to do that is to give you a passage from my mother. She was the ultimate authority on Daddy. And she gave an interview to the Departments of Archives and History in the 80s, and this is taken from the transcript of that interview. So I'm not reading something that I wrote or even something that she wrote. This is actually from an interview. He was really an extremely social sort of person. He liked people. He loved talking, very intellectual, but if he found a person who went with him, well, he was very pleased to talk and to be very social. He had beautiful manners. He was the kind of person who tipped his hat and bowed. Just a fine sort of person. When he was close to people, he was terribly good. If he found out that a friend of his was ill or in trouble or anything like that, he would go to them immediately. It didn't matter to him what he was doing. If he was involved in work or just in from Horn Island, or if he was ill himself, he'd go straight to whoever needed him. He was wonderful. It seems strange, but he was a born nurse. He knew what people needed and wanted when they were ill, and he wanted to take care of them. Now that's not the image that most people have of Walter Anderson. I mean, is that the way anyone thought of Walter Anderson? But for me, my mother was the ultimate authority, and if she said he was a very social person, then he was a very social person. But again, there are these mysteries about him. His work was consistent with that image. He spent almost every minute of every day of his life creating beautiful images to share the things that he valued most with other people. So his work was very consistent with what my mother said. But then you look at him from a slightly different angle, and he also camped in solitude for 20 years on a wilderness island. And a lot of people have made assumptions based upon that, which were not really consistent with the overall image. Anthony discovered him through his art, and he discovered something that meant a great deal to him, and he wanted very much to share that with other people. I discovered him, what I should have said when Ken first asked me about the island, I actually discovered him by sailing a small boat out to Horn Island and camping on the island for an extended period in solitude. and looking at the world from his perspective. And the important thing about this book is that it allows people to look at the world from his perspective. So what you see, if you read the book, you don't see Walter Anderson. You see the world. You see the world from his perspective. And if you look at his paintings and see how incredibly beautiful they were, it's a perspective that just about anyone would want to experience. You would want to see the world in that way. You would want to see a world that was that beautiful. You would want to spend some of your time in Eden. And again, everything he did was very consistent with the image that his art created. One of the last things he did in his life was to put a collection of his paintings in the little room in his cottage and put on top a handwritten copy of the 104th Psalm. And the 104th Psalm is a song of thanks. He was grateful. He felt that he had been allowed to live in Eden, and he was incredibly grateful. And that art, that mural in that little room, were his song of thanks for everything that he had been given. So if you want to take a look through Walter Anderson's eyes, this book offers an opportunity.
Wesley, can you tell us about an image or two in your book that was or were particularly difficult to photograph and that you are now most proud of?
Interesting. First of all, Walter Anderson is the Mississippi jewel, so it's a privilege to be here with you. That's a hard one. I love every one of them. It's an amazing thing. There's 400 photographs in the book, and when I look back through them, I can remember exactly where I was on every one of them, and in what part of the swamp and the bottomlands I was at. It's remarkable recall on it. I'll give you a couple. One of them is a little nondescript butterfly called a gemmed satyr. Most of you have probably never heard of it. Most of you have probably never seen it. It's an extraordinary butterfly right here in Mississippi. People from Africa and Brazil should come here to see it. It is a little butterfly that rarely comes above your knees. You have to go to the bottomlands of Flora's Bluff and the Pearl River drainage to see it. It's gray drab, except on its back hind wings, it has tattooed a spider. Tattooed a spider on its hind wings. Not just an eye spot like a lot of butterflies do to try to intimidate a would-be predator, but the entire spider. It's an extraordinary thing, and some call it God's world. I call it Darwin's world, but nonetheless, it's our world. And to think that this organism, through thousands and thousands of generations, has bit by bit created a tattoo of a spider on its hind wings is remarkable. That it would do this, and you have to look very hard to be able to see it. It's very hard to even see these little things because they live in swampy areas, which are dark and shadowy to begin with. They're gray and nondescript, but if you ever get the chance to see this little critter, it is absolutely remarkable, and it's equally remarkable to think how it ever got to that point. Survival of the fittest. Those that had it survived better, passed on their genes. Those that didn't are now to be found in the fossil record. So that would be one.
How did you get that photograph?
By standing very still and holding the camera very still. I wouldn't know how to operate a drone at all. You have a career in Ukraine, I think, down there. Were shots that I took watching them. It's a butterfly no larger than a quarter. And again, as Ken correctly said, photography is about light, and light is a very precious thing in a swamp. You don't get a lot of it, and when you do, you get shadows and all sorts of contrasty images. It's not so easy. But if you work at it long enough, you get lucky. And I've now gotten to a point I get lucky more often than not. And it's one of those organisms, if you ever get a chance to see it, and again, what I said in the first time I spoke, you don't have to travel far to see it. I could take you just a mile or two from here and we could find one, and it would be one of the most impressive things I think you've ever seen. And when you think about how it got there and what it is, it too is stunning. A second photograph that I'm very proud of was one I took on my belly, about a 180-yard shot across Mays Lake and LaFleur's Bluff, again, a few miles from here. Across at dusk, one of the most remarkable migrations occurs right in Jackson, and in Mays Lake on the back cypresses, about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, dusk, birds start flying in from all parts of Mississippi, hundreds of them. Egrets, herons, roseate spoonbills, storks come in, and you find them on the back cypresses, and nothing equals it anywhere in the world, and people don't even know it exists. But it exists out there in the fall and the late summer. And it occurs almost nightly, but most people go home, go into their little sheltered environment, watch PBS, and have no idea what's going on around them. And that was a 180-yard shot at dusk, again, where there's very little light. And so you have to hold, again, the camera incredibly still to be able to get such shots. But that's one I'm very proud of. Thought about putting it on the cover, but the Prothonotary warbler won out.
Are there some questions? We have about 15 minutes, and if there are questions from the group here, we will certainly entertain those in this. And I'll repeat your question so the whole group can hear it in the room, but please, go ahead. For Ken.
Yes, ma'am. All right.
Ken, could you repeat the question?
She's asking if missing a finger had any effect on my photography. Well, not really. But it did create a funny story one day. When I was in the Army, they put me in the hobby shop. One of my jobs was to show other people how to use a camera, which I had to teach myself, and then I had to teach them. So one day I'm teaching a class like this, and I'm holding my camera like this, and I look out in the audience, and everybody in the audience is using their middle finger instead of their trigger finger. And I was like, if you have one, use it. But other than that, you know, I was very fortunate. I mean, I came very close to losing my whole hand, and I thank God every day. Matter of fact, when the surgeon woke me up, and Sergeant Murphy had to take off one of your fingers. I was like, really? Just one? Good job, Doc. I was happy, you know, because I thought it was gone. I thought the whole thing was done. I was a late bloomer.
When did you switch to digital was the question.
Yeah. She's asking when did I switch to digital photography. I was a late bloomer when coming to digital photography because, like Wesley, I really started out as a nature photographer. You know Elliot Porter, the nature photographer?
I do.
Yeah.
I don't know him, but I know of him.
I mean, yeah, you know what? Yeah. He's a famous nature photographer back in the day. Shot a lot of 4x5 nature images. Anybody know what a 4x5 transparency is? Or negative? What was my point?
Digital.
Oh yeah, digital. So the reason I was a late bloomer was because I kept watching digital, and I was what I call a slow shooter. So I liked long exposures, to get that late light and all this kind of stuff. And the digital images in the beginning had too much noise on long exposures. So I would just keep watching. I said, it's not there yet. It's not there yet. It's not there yet. And then one day I took a picture and I said, let me try something. And I took a picture. I took the same picture with a film and digital, and I blew it up. And I was like, dang, it's there. I got to teach myself digital. So I had, then I bought me a digital camera, and the rest, as they say, is history. When? That would have been when I did my blues book. The blues book was the first digital project I did. And the reason I wanted to do that one in digital was because of the ability of the new digital cameras to capture low light handheld. And that book is all digital, with the exception there's one 4x5 image in it. And I tell people, I'll give you $5 if you can tell me which picture it is. Because if you don't know, anybody that knows large format might be able to pick it out, but if you don't know, you can't tell. And that's when I knew it was time. And when I was in college in '83 in New York, digital was being experimented. It was, and they would give us stuff to play with, and it just wasn't there yet. But in class one day, I predicted that the digital world, the digital photography would be the choice of the commercial guy, and film would become the choice of the artist. And that happened, but now I'm seeing some commercial guys going back to film because they think it's got a different look. So I'm like, I don't see that, but whatever.
Other questions? This gentleman right here.
The question was complex. It was basically how do other people's responses to my father make me feel about him? And it's a good question. I really learned who my father was from people like you, because people would come to me and say, wow, I remember very specifically a woman who stopped me outside of the Shearwater Pottery showroom, and she had just been to an exhibit of Daddy's art, and her eyes were glowing and sparkling, and she came up to me and said, what's it like to grow up at Shearwater Pottery and have such an extraordinary artist for a father? And I looked at her and I kind of started fidgeting, because at that time I had no idea that my father was an extraordinary artist. And Shearwater Pottery was the only place I had grown up, and I didn't know anything different. So basically what I learned from her was that I was an idiot. But I knew somebody who wasn't an idiot, my mother. So I went to her and I said, Mama, why are all these extraordinary people so fascinated with Daddy? From my perspective, growing up at Shearwater, when I was a child, everyone called him the Horn Island Hermit, you know. And we were embarrassed by him. He was riding around town on a rusty bicycle, and we were all very embarrassed by him. And she thought about it for a little while. She was rocking in her rocking chair and petting an old cat she had named Old Yellow. And she said, your father was a shaman. He explored life. He went out to the edge of the cosmos, looked back, and then he came back and tried to communicate what he had discovered with other people through his art. And when she saw the blank look in my face, because I had no idea what she was talking about, she said, maybe you better go out to Horn Island. And a couple of months later, I was pushing a little boat out of the marsh at Shearwater, 3 o'clock in the morning, and going out to Horn Island, and stayed out there for about 10 days alone by myself. And when I came back, I had seen the world through his eyes a little bit, and wow, it was completely different from everything that I thought it was. But that all came from that woman. That all came from someone like you who saw something and then shared what they saw with me. And that has continued to happen. Anthony Thaxton, who I keep mentioning, saw Daddy very, 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 very clearly. And he and I wanted to show that to other people. So basically what this is all about is me wanting to share what you've just shared with me with other people. That's what it's about. So, Mm-hmm. Woo. I have tried repeatedly to communicate that with other people. And it's not, I don't think you can communicate it through words. It's an experience. Scott, who went out there on one of those recent camping trips, it could probably do a better job than me. It's transformative because for everyone, yeah, it's a different perspective. The people here who are artists will understand the power of perspective. It's very important. If you look at the world from a different perspective, you see different things. And perspective can be very complex. You know, if you go camp on Horn Island for 4 or 5 days, it transforms you physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. It changes your perspective. In the book, I refer to it as the difference between looking at nature and looking from nature. Just a quick digression. All 3 of these books have something in common. All 3 of these books are basically about a sense of place. Wesley deliberately focused his book on what you could see in La Flor Bluff State Park. He wanted to incorporate a sense of place into into the book, into the perception that you get from that book. So, and Ken is talking about a place. He's talking about my South Coast home. He's showing you his home through his eyes. So, anyway, is that?
And we just have a moment or two, but there was a lady right here that had a question as well.
Oh, I can't. He was a minimalist, pretty much, you know. He was interested in experiencing life as part of nature. And very often the things we carry with us are deliberately intended to insulate us or separate us from nature. As I say, when he was in that pool, he was completely naked. You know, it was Adam in a hat. I think he took maybe a wool blanket. Sometimes he took a tarpaulin, something to keep the rain off. But you'll get that if you read the book. You'll get an idea of what he had with him and what he didn't have with him. But it was minimalist. I'm reading a book right now called A Walk in the Park, which is hiking through the Grand Canyon. And it's all about what you don't take with you. You know, you can't carry anything because it's so rugged. Any extra ounce that you carry is a handicap. Yeah.
I would like to invite each of you, though our session must end here in this room at the moment, please continue the conversation. Each of these three gentlemen will be at the signing tent at 11 a.m. And you can continue the conversation with them there individually and peruse their books. And I'm sure they'll be willing to continue to engage with you and address some of the great questions you've had. But let's give a round of applause to these three gentlemen.
Hey, Scott, can I just say something real quick?
Absolutely.
Talking about John here. Walter Anderson is so important, and I like including everything in my books that are important to Mississippi. So John is in the book, Shearwater's in the book, Walter Anderson Museum is in the book, Horn Island is in the book. So, did you even see this yet?
Oh, yeah. I actually drove to Pass Christine to buy a copy of your book, but they were sold out.
They weren't even available. They just came in yesterday, or day before yesterday.
Oh, that's why they were sold out.
Yeah. We've been humping books for 2 days now. It's killing me.
We'll have them tomorrow, John. Ken tells me what.
One more quick
thank
thing.
you, everyone, for joining us.